I want to talk to you guys about something that's just based in reality, and that is something from Byzantine history. I'm reading this book. This is a six part book, 6 volume book. Actually, no, 10 volume book. I want to say. So this is part one of this series that I've been reading. This is called The Histories, and I really cannot remember this man's name, but his name is Laonikos Chalkokondyles. Anybody who can speak Greek, how do you pronounce this guy's name? Laonikos Chalkok. I got to do the phonics game. Laonikos Chalkokondyles. Laonikos Chokokondyles. Chalkok. Anyway, this dude, he lived at the time when Constantinople was sacked. Okay? He lived in the time period when Constantinople was sacked, and he was a very prestigious person at his time, this Laonikos guy. And he writes a lot about what was going on before the sacking of Constantinople. And the only reason why I got this book is because I want to learn about what the hell was going on before Constantinople got sacked. I read about the actual sacking of Constantinople, and everyone has heard about this, right? 1453, Ottomans invaded the city, they sacked the city, they killed the inhabitants, enslaved the inhabitants, pretty horrendous. But I want to know what was going on before. Because one thing I've noticed about historical events like the sacking of Constantinople is that they are always preceded by tremendous corruption. So you have something horrendous like the sacking, the conquest of Constantinople, which is one of the greatest moments in human history, right? Because here you have the eastern capital, the capital of the Roman Empire, right? What was the Roman Empire at its time? Because when we think of Rome in Italy, but the Roman Empire continued on through Constantinople. So you have the continuation of the Roman Empire through Constantinople, and it all disappears. It all ends. What was left of it is completely and utterly taken over by the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire inherits the Roman Empire, and it becomes sort of the Islamic continuation of the Roman Empire. And Mehmet II even called himself Caesar. He said, I am now the Caesar. So when people talk about events like this, they will tend just to talk about the event itself, but they don't really get into what was going on beforehand. And I want to know what was going on before, because people have this idea when they get into the whole Christian versus Muslim topic. They tend to speak as if you had... They tend to speak in very black and white ways. And what I mean by that is they speak as if you had just Christendom and then you had Islamdom. And Islamdom just came in, crushed Constantinople. But they don't really get into the nitty-gritty of it all. It's like when people talk about World War II, they'll say, well, you had Third Reich, Nazi Germany, and then America comes in, saves the day. Well, that's a part of the story, but that's not the whole story. That's the ending. You're reading the end of the story. What's the beginning of the story, right? When it comes to the Third Reich, well, you find out that America kind of liked Hitler initially. Wait, what? Yeah, America kind of liked him. Then you find out all these American industrialists also kind of liked Hitler, and they wanted to do business with him. And then you read about, you read about how after World War I, America financed the rebuilding of Germany and the reindustrialization of Germany, and how without that financialization of Germany's industry, without that financing of Germany's industry, there would have been no Third Reich. And then you read about how there was all these people in Wall Street who kind of liked Hitler, or they liked Hitler, and they liked what he was doing with eugenics, and so they supported him. So then you find out that there was this Frankenstein called the Third Reich, but America was a big played a big role in the creation of this monster. And then eventually America had to go in there and save the day. But once you factor in all of these details, then you have a better understanding as to what happened. And then you have a better understanding as to what can happen in the future. That in the future, America and major powers like America can create a Frankenstein that it later has to deal with. And America has done this in the past, not just with Hitler, but America played a role in the revival of Islamic fundamentalism and then had to deal with Islamic fundamentalism in the future. So when you look at these big events like World War II or the sacking of the conquest of Constantinople, what's more, to me, it is important to read about the events themselves, but it is equally as important to also read about the events that preceded those particular occurrences. So it's very important to read about the events that precede those particular events. That way we can understand how these events take place. So that when we look at our own time, when we look at the current events in our own time, we can say, oh, okay, this is where this is going, right? This is what this is leading us to. And you can, in a way, I'm not going to say you can predict the future, but you can have sort of a rough understanding as to what we are leading ourselves into. So, very important. So, one thing that I have learned reading this book is that it was not black and white at all. And I'm not reading some modern book that's critical of Christianity. This is a book written by a Greek guy who lived at the time of the sacking of Constantinople and who covers the history of what happened before the sacking, or I should say the conquest of Constantinople. And what I have learned reading this book is that Christians were killing each other massively before the conquest of Constantinople. Centuries before, Christians were slaughtering each other. Europeans were slaughtering each other. And it wasn't always just Greek Orthodox Christian versus evil Muslim. Many times it was Greek Orthodox Christians fighting against other Greek Orthodox Christians and then making deals with the Turks. And there was also, you will also find Turks killing each other and then the Greeks coming in and picking a faction against the faction that they want to destroy, in the hopes that they can take advantage of the divisions within the Ottoman Empire to undermine and weaken the Ottoman Empire and also to gain territory for themselves. You also had Greeks versus Italians. The Italians actually controlled parts of Greece back in the medieval period, going into the late medieval period. You had Italians controlling parts of Greece, and the Greeks and the Italians fought and killed each other for territory. So one thing that I have learned over the years reading this type of history is that there was never really a moment when the Christians and the Muslims were fighting each other that you did not have Christians killing one another. Let me rephrase that because I don't think I stated that in a very articulate way. You never had a moment when the Muslims and Christians were killing each other when Christians were not killing each other. When Muslims and Christians fought each other, Christians were also killing each other. Europeans were killing each other. Europeans were killing each other. So, never really was there a moment when Christendom was truly united. The closest thing to united Europe the closest thing that you can get to a united Europe against Islam was the First Crusade. That was the first. I think that is the closest thing that you can find in history of Christians united together against Islam. And even then, during the First Crusade, you had Europeans killing each other. Because the Europeans came in, and specifically the French came in, the Franks, they took over Jerusalem. But guess what? the Franks began to rival with each other as to over who was going to control Jerusalem. And the Crusades ended up just decaying into a big power battle, a big struggle over power between European Christians. And you can read about, for example, the crusade that was launched by Richard the Lionheart. Why did Richard the Lionheart abandon the mission to take Jerusalem? Well, there were really two reasons. One was because he had advisors who told him that Jerusalem was impenetrable because it was so well guarded, and Salah ad-Din had all these catapults, and he wasn't really going to have the capacity to penetrate Jerusalem. But the main reason why Richard the Lionheart did not take Jerusalem was because Europeans back in Europe stole his land. They stole his stuff. There were French people who stole his territory. And Richard the Lionheart said, I got to go back to Europe and kill my own people. I got to go fight my own people. So people had this idea that back in the day it was just Christian versus Muslim, and it was Christendom, and there was Islamdom, and they were all fighting each other. No, when you look at the history of Christian-Islamic wars, there was really never a moment when Christians weren't killing each other. Europeans were always fighting and killing one another. And today, in our own time, there is no Christendom. We just have Europe. We have the West, right? The so-called West. There is no Christendom anymore. Oh, that's why I kind of laugh when I hear people say, "Oh, well, Christendom is dying." Christendom died a very long time ago, guys. Christendom, the death of Christendom can be traced. You can go back to the time of the Knights of St. John. The Knights of St. John, I guess, could be called the final Crusaders. Well, they were 500 monks on an island. Nobody really gave a damn. Nobody was there to help them. There was 500 monks, and you had some mercenaries. You had some Spanish mercenaries that were there, and that was pretty much it. Nobody really gave a damn about the Knights of St. John. So Christendom died a long time ago. Oh, the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto was won by the Holy League, and the Holy League was dismantled about a year after the Battle of Lepanto. And even during the Battle of Lepanto, the Holy League was prohibited by the British. The British would not allow its citizens to join the Holy League, even though they knew that the Holy League was used to fight against the Ottomans. The British didn't support it. It was dismantled, like I said, about a year after the Battle of Lepanto. So Christendom started decaying a long time ago, and then it died a long time ago. There is no Christendom. It's just Europe, and there's the West. There's no Christendom, okay? The closest thing that you can find in history of a united Christendom against Islamdom was the First Crusade. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. But that was done at a time when the Pope said, you guys are killing each other too much. Europeans can't stop killing each other. You guys are like Hutsis and Tutsis over here. And we need a way to unite the Christians. So what did the Pope do? The Pope said, let's fight the Muslims. The Muslims are evil. They're killing Christians. They're killing pilgrims. The Seljuks are barbarians. And they were barbarians. We have to unite and go against the Muslims. And so in the First Crusade, you had mainly Franks, but you also had Italians, and you had Irish people that joined the Crusades, and you had English people who joined the Crusades, and you had all sorts of different peoples, European nations. You had all sorts of peoples from various European nations unite together to join the First Crusade. That's the closest thing you can get to a united Christendom. But even when you read about the First Crusade, you will read about how the Christians, the Western Christians, and the Greek Christians hated each other. There was a book I read years ago. Oh, what was it called? It was a book written by a Byzantine historian. I forgot his name. But he wrote about I remember reading this guy's book, and he wrote about the First Crusade. I'm pretty certain he was alive during the First Crusade. And he talked about the Franks coming over, heading towards Jerusalem to go take Jerusalem from the Muslims. And this is a crazy story. He talked about how even during the First Crusade, you had Frankish Christians going into Constantinople trying to undermine its walls. And there's a crazy story I read in his book. It talked about how these French Catholics, they call them Franks, they were just French people. There's Marine Le Pen's ancestors. These Frankish Catholics were digging a tunnel underneath the walls of Constantinople. And here were these French guys, they were digging their way. They were, we're going to take this damn city. And I remember reading about this. And I think this was around the time of the First Crusade or right before it. And they didn't know that the Greeks were armed with something called Greek fire, blue fire. And the Greeks had flamethrowers. Oh, yes. The Greeks had flamethrowers, all right? And these Franks were digging their tunnel, and the Greeks saw the Franks coming in, and the Greeks just said, hit him with the blue fire. And they hit him with the blue fire, and all those guys burned alive. And there was one event that I remember reading about how there was a Frankish Catholic priest charging after Greek soldiers with a sword. Charging after them. And a Greek archer fired an arrow, hit the priest. And the book I was reading, this Greek guy who wrote the book, he said that this Catholic priest was hit by an arrow, and he kept charging after the Greeks, even though an arrow was in him. And he kept going, and he kept going, and the Greeks hit him with another arrow. And he got hit with an arrow, and he kept on going. And they said, this Greek guy said, we had to hit this guy with like 8 arrows before he finally dropped. The guy had some serious energy. Maybe he was, I don't know, empowered by the papacy or something. I don't know what gave him the energy, but this guy just kept on going. So there were some wild fights between the Greeks and the Franks. And this was centuries before the Franks the Normans eventually just sacked Constantinople. But that's another thing, in the midst of the crusade between the Muslims and the Catholics, the Catholics sacked Constantinople. I mean, we talk about, the Ottoman Empire sacking Constantinople. The Catholics did that before. They sacked Constantinople. They raped, they pillaged. My point is that there was never a time when the Christians were not killing each other. There was never a time when the Europeans were not killing each other. There was never a time during the Muslim Christian wars, there was never a time when the Europeans were not killing each other. Never. And even when you read this book, I mean, most of this book is Greeks, and the Greek guy hated this Greek guy, and the Greeks hated this Greek guy, wanted to take power, but he hated his father, he hated his brother, blah, 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 blah. And there's Turks also who kill each other. Bayezid, before he became Sultan, he murdered his brother. After the Battle of Kosovo, the Serbs will know this one. Well, right before the end of the battle over Kosovo, Bayezid murdered his own brother so that he could become the Sultan. I love this instrument. And the book talks about how there was this Sultan, Mehmet I. And Mehmet I had Bayezid had a bunch of sons. A very fascinating story. This I'm just telling you what's in this book, because they're historians who question, they question what was written in this book. But I'm just going to tell you what's in this book. The Sultan Bayezid. The Sultan Bayezid had all these sons. And he had one named Musa and Yusuf, and he had all these different sons. And, Bayezid, before he became the Sultan, he murdered his own brother. He had his own brother strangled to death so that he could get rid of the competition and become the Sultan. And his sons ended up killing one another. So just as he murdered his own brother, his sons murdered each other for power. And there was one son that he had. In the book, it says that his name was Isa, which is the Islamic way of saying Jesus. But historians will say that the name of this son actually was Yusuf. Regardless, the book tells us that the emperor, that the Sultan Bayezid, had a son by the name of Isa. And this son saw his brothers killing one another for power, vying for power, killing one another for power. And Isa said, I do not want to participate in this. I do not want to participate in these squabbles and in these murderous rivalries between my brothers. And do you know what this son did? This son of the Sultan Bayezid? Do you know what he did, according to this book? This book tells us that Isa went to the Greeks and he told the Greeks, let me convert to your religion. He had no interest in Islam. He wanted to leave Islam and convert to the religion of Jesus, to the faith of Jesus. So he went over to the Greeks and he said, let me convert to your religion. He wanted to take part. He wanted to not take part at all in the murderous rivalries of his brothers. He went to the side of the Greeks. He converted to Christianity, got confirmed into the Eastern Orthodox Church, and then he died in absolute obscurity. Now, isn't that an amazing story? And after he died, his brothers were killing each other. So the one brother that is not power hungry, that isn't murderous, that does not want to take part at all in any of these murderous, bloody rivalries. The one brother who didn't want to do any of this violence converts to Christianity and dies. Not too long after that. It's almost as if it was almost as if God said, come home. It's over. You don't have to be in this earth anymore. Come home. And the other brothers, they lived for years and years after this guy's death. And what did they do? How did they spend their time on earth? They spent their time on this earth by killing one another. It's a crazy story. It's crazy stories in this book. That stuff happened in the Serbian Dynasty. And he talks about the Serbs. He gets into the Serbs, this guy. Let me see if I can recount you some of this stuff. So the one son of Bayezid that would eventually become a sultan a sultan by himself without the rivalry of his brothers was Mehmet I. So Mehmet I, he eventually kills his brother Musa, and then he just takes full control. He has no other brothers to rival with him. And Mehmet I becomes the sultan. And Mehmet I had two sons. One was Mustafa and the other was Murad, according to this book. And Murad was the older brother, so Murad naturally was supposed to be the successor of his father. But Mustafa, his younger brother, said, no, I am the Sultan. So guess what happened? They had a violent rivalry. And eventually, Murad killed his brother Mustafa. He had his brother Mustafa strangled to death. Now, before this happened, the Greeks came along and they said, okay, how do we take advantage of this? Okay. We'll side with Mustafa against Murad. And they thought by picking a faction, they could weaken the Ottoman Empire. Well, what ended up happening was Murad ambushed his brother Mustafa and strangled him to death. So you had divisions even between the Turks. Is the book generally considered a reliable account by modern historians? It is considered to be, generally speaking, a good source for history. Though there are some details that are corrected by the translator, and all the corrections can be read in the notes in the back of the book. Nonetheless, if you just read the story without the corrections or without the opinions of the translator, stories are pretty fascinating. One of the Nemanjić brothers went to the monastery and became a monk while his brothers killed each other. Not very different from... Yeah, it's very interesting. His name is Rastko Nemanjić, and he is a first Serbian scholar or teacher. Oh, very interesting. Yeah, and so one thing I've learned, be it in the Crusades or be it later on during the Byzantine era, the Europeans were always killing each other. Be it Greek versus Italian, Greek versus Greek, Frank versus Greek. And here's the thing: the Turks, the so-called Ottomans, so-called Turkish Ottomans, they were also European. Islam is a part of Europe. I hate to say it, but it's the truth. When you consider the fact that the Albanians have been Muslim for centuries, the Bosnians have been Muslim for centuries, when you consider the fact that what is known as Turkey today had not been called Turkey until the end of World War I, and when you consider the fact that what we call Turkey today was called Anatolia until the end of World War I, when you consider all of these things, you realize Islam is actually a part of Europe. Chechnya, Dagestan, it's all part of Europe, and it's Islamic. They are white Muslims, and white Muslims have been around for centuries. So Islamic history is a part of European history. It's just a fact. Oh, you're into like woke. No, it's not nothing woke. It's just a fact. Just like Christianity is a part of European history. Although Christianity has played a much bigger role in Europe than Islam has. But still, you can't forget the fact that Bosnia, European country, is Muslim. Turkey, Muslim country, is also part of Europe. And if you look at the genetic makeup of people in Turkey, they're mostly Europeans. They're mostly European. Turk. The real Turks are in Central Asia, not in Anatolia. Real Turks are in Central Asia. They're not in Turkey. Turkey was not called Turkey until the end of World War I. Before that, it was called Anatolia. And Anatolia was what was used to label basically the Asiatic Greek lands. Asiatic Greece being in the land that we call Turkey today. Troy, the Trojan War, Troy was a part of that Asiatic land. It was a part of Anatolia. And the Trojans were not really what we would consider Asians. The Trojans were an Indo-European people. They weren't even Greek. They were Indo-Europeans. They were related to the Hittites. The Hittites were another Indo-European people who lived in Anatolia. The Lydians were another Anatolian people who were also Indo-European. There were the Phrygians, another Indo-European people who lived in Anatolia. These are all ancient Europeans. Their descendants are alive today in Anatolia, in Turkey. And they call themselves Turks, but they're really white Europeans. Turkey is a part of Europe. So when we talk about Europeans killing each other, we would also have to include Western Europeans or Greeks, who are also Europeans, fighting against Anatolians, Anatolian Muslims, Indo-European Muslims. That's what the Turks are. So when we say, oh, the Turks sacked Constantinople, what we're really saying is Anatolians, Indo-European Muslims, sacked Constantinople. An Indo-European Islamic empire called the Ottoman Empire sacked Constantinople, took over Constantinople. So Europeans have always been killing each other. And eventually, Turkey is going to fight against the Russians. And that's also going to be Europeans killing each other. And if you look at, so my whole point, the whole point of me bringing this stuff up is when you look at history and you see that the Europeans were always killing each other, then we can say in the future, Europeans are going to kill each other. And they're killing each other right now, by the way. Ukrainians versus Russians. And here's the thing is people will say, oh no, Europeans aren't going to go to war because Europeans aren't having kids. Excuse me, what the hell do you call Ukraine and Russia? Those are white people killing each other. Europeans killing each other. Serbia versus Bosnia in 1990s. Serbia versus Croatia in the 1990s. Serbia versus Albanians in the 1990s. Those were Europeans killing each other in the 1990s. Europeans will always find ways to go to war with each other. It's a part of their history. Just like all the other wars that happen in human history. And the whole point of me bringing this up is to tell you that in the future, there's going to be a greater European war. And people will say, well, Europe doesn't have enough kids and blah, blah, how's that going to happen? Excuse me, Russia also has a population crisis. Russians also don't have a lot of kids. And they're at war right now. A country not having a lot of kids is not going to stop that country from going to war. So, because Europeans have always fought each other, even when they were fighting against the Muslims, we can say that in the future, there's going to be a greater European conflict. Kind of like what happened in World War I and World War II. Let me see if I can find some interesting stories here. So here is a story of the Greeks and the Italians fighting each other over Greek territory. The city of Patras. The Italians and the Greeks were fighting over this city called Patras. And it says here that the Italian rulers of the Peloponnese. So the Italians once controlled the Peloponnese. Peloponnese is where the Spartans were. You ever read about the Peloponnesian Wars and all that? The Italian rulers of the Peloponnese from the house of Zaccaria. So there was this very powerful Italian family called the Zaccaria family, and they controlled the Peloponnese. So from the house of Zaccaria had passed through the city of Achaia, and one stayed behind as lord and ruler of the land, while the other visited the pontiff of the Romans, who entrusted the city to him to supervise as its bishop. Who entrusted the city to him to supervise as its bishop. Okay, so the city had passed to the pontiff of the Romans and received from him its own bishop, whomever he sent to them to supervise the city. At that time, he had sent as bishop to the citizens a member of the Malatesta family. When Constantinos took over the city, he continued to besiege the Acropolis for 1 year. After that, it surrendered to him. But the triremes were giant warships, battleships, of the pontiff took the capital of Elis. So the pontiff gets involved to take Greek territory. The Pope got involved to take Greek territory. So it wasn't just the Muslims and the Christians killing each other. It was the Christians killing the Christians as well. For when he learned that the city of Achaia, Patras, had been taken by Greeks, he sent 10 of them in the hope that they would take the city back. So the Italians were controlling the Peloponnese, and the Greeks took it back, and then the Pope found out, oh my God, the Greeks took it. We can't let them damn Greek Orthodox people take Roman Catholic territory. Well, it was Greece, and Greece was initially Greek Catholic, so of course the Greeks are going to try to take it back. But we can't have that happen, because it has to be Roman Catholic. But they did not go to Achaia, for when they reached Glanetza, the ruler was absent and there was no garrison in the city. So you fast forward and it says, later they sold it to the brother of the king, Thomas. Thomas was a Greek. For 5,000 gold coins, sounds like Total War Medieval 2, and sailed back to Italy. So the Italians sold it back to the Greeks. Say, oh, you take it. Here, give us some money. The city had previously experienced other vicissitudes of fortune as well, for Oliverio had set out from Italy when the city was being held by the ruler of Achaia, and he attacked it suddenly, took it. So the Italians come, and they take Patras or Achaia back. So the Italians, they attack the city, take the city, and then they enslave the city, it says. He took the ruler's daughter as his wife. So the Italians say, okay, this land belongs to us. They take over Patras, and then they take the daughter of the ruler. The guy takes the daughter of the ruler as his wife. He says, okay, your daughter's going to marry me. And it wasn't like, oh, no, does she consent? Oh, no, they didn't care about that stuff. When it was taken by the pontiff's Triarmis, he bought it and took it back again. Okay, yeah, so the Italian, he takes the city, he conquers the city, enslaves it, takes the daughter of the ruler as his wife, then he sold it back to this guy named Carlo I, who I think was also Italian, and then he departed back to Italy. Thus the Greeks were at war with the Italian ruler of Achaia. His name was Centurione for a long time. Then eventually the Greeks defeated the Italians, and it says, thus the Peloponnese passed from the hands of the Italians into those of the Greeks, and this was the situation for the Greeks, who had now subjected the Peloponnese to themselves. And then the next line is, Murad, the son of Mehmed, now marched against the land of the Serbs. So here you're reading about how the Turks invaded Serbia, but then before that you're reading about how the Greeks and the Italians were killing each other. My whole point is that there was never a time during the Christian-Islamic wars when the Europeans were not killing each other. So people think, oh, in the future it's going to be Christendom versus Islamdom. No, it's not. It's going to be Christians fighting Muslims, but also Europeans fighting each other. Just like in World War I, where you had the Ottomans fighting the English, but you also had the Germans allying with the Ottomans against the English, or the British, I should say. So, if history is a teacher, it teaches us that in the future, the Europeans will kill one another. And that's it. Those are my thoughts on that. I'm going to read your guys' comments now. Creating enemies in order to unite. Sounds familiar, yeah. Some people are built differently. Everybody talks about the sack of Kaliningrad like nothing ever happened in Zadar. Can you listen to The Man Who Stole the World live in loud Nirvana? Okay, hold on. I still got to play a video game. So is the book... Okay, I already read that. I think they were mostly Asiatic, related to Mongols. The original Turks are related to the Mongolians. And their blood is still lurking about in some of the veins of the people in Anatolia. But you can say that about Hungarians. I mean, the Hungarians were invaded by the Huns, and that's why they speak Hunnic. The Hungarian language is Hunnic. It's an Asiatic language, just like people in Anatolia today speak Turkish. But genetically speaking, blood-wise, the people in Turkey today are mainly European. Have very little Eastern... Yeah, that's correct. They have very little Eastern Asian or Central Asian DNA. What about Seljuks? Were they Arabs or European? Seljuks were Central Asian. They were basically Turkmens. They were Uzbeks, Kazakhs. But again, the people in Turkey today, their ancestry, for the most part, didn't come from Central Asia. Though their ancestry was in Anatolia as Indo-Europeans thousands of years ago. And somebody is speaking in Serbian Croat, so I can't understand what you're saying. The black clothes, I think, is because those game devs want to be Steve Jobs. It's just something with game culture where they just love the color black. I mean, I don't know what it is. That totally sucks, Ted. Welcome to the Club of the Disabled. We have a support group and we meet at the bar. Yeah. It's crazy to think Rome lasted 2,000. That is insane. Yeah, absolutely insane. Much like the EU and Germany especially helped Russia by making themselves reliant on their gas. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Russia is supposed to be the big enemy, but here you have Germany making a deal with the Russians to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline so they can get direct natural gas from the Russians. Oh, and Iran is supposed to be the big enemy, but you have the Germans wanting to make commercial deals with them, to the ire of the Americans. So yes, absolutely. This fact of human existence can be applied to the Western European Russian conflict. Absolutely. Or the NATO-Russian conflict, however you want to call it. Is this dude still... I'm still very Christian. Yes, still very Christian. But reading the history of so-called Christendom, you realize that it's not all black and white. Part of Christianity is facing the truth.